All right. Good day to everyone. Welcome to another Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Alan Bevere, your host, and I am a pastor, retired in another week and a half from my interim, and a professor, a Bible moth, a theologian in exile, feel more in exile every day, and peddler of hope. And I'm the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Culture here at Faith Seeking Understanding University. And on Calmly Considered, my conversation partner, the Grand Poobah Chair of Economics and Public Theology here at FSU is Michael Cruz. Michael, it's been a while.
Yeah, it has. You've been out gallivanting around the world. It's been hard to have
Yeah,
these.
I sort of hopped a couple of continents, and
Yeah,
so we've had a little hiatus due to me, but we're back to have
yeah,
our conversation, and we'll try and get back to our monthly things here.
sure.
And good to see you. Good to have conversation again.
Yeah, good to see you
Um,
too.
so let's talk a little sports. And it is baseball season. It's the
Yeah.
season for the greatest sport ever invented. And
Yes.
your Royals and my Guardians are in the same division. And I can't believe how the Guardians have played this year. I don't think anyone expected them to play as well as they have.
Well, they sure have. They've been on fire this year. It's been fun to
Yeah,
watch them. Yeah.
they've been fun to watch, and they won last night. They beat the Mariners. They had I don't know, 5 games or what it was. They had a five
Right.
losses or a skid or something like that. And I was
Right.
there Tuesday night, and they lost. So you
Right.
know, I just always want to go to at least one game where they win. But
Right.
I just love baseball, so we had a good time at the park, and it was great. And
Yeah.
your Royals, they're
They are on
um,
top of it.
yeah,
This is probably about a week ago. I saw an article that talked about that they were on a par to win something like 92 games or something like
yeah,
that if they continued at the rate they had up to that point. And
yeah.
if they did that, it would be the biggest one season flip in wins since the 1903 Giants. So if they need 15 more wins to have as many wins as they had all of last year, they could possibly do that before the All-Star break.
That's
So
amazing. That's
that's
amazing.
pretty cool. However, today they are playing a game to avoid being swept by the A's,
Oh,
which
well,
is
they better
that's
win
pretty
it.
sad.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
that
anyway,
is pretty sad. It's pretty sad. Yeah, but you did beat the Yankees earlier in the year,
and that
right?
was fun. And they beat the
And
Dodgers once.
anytime the
Yeah,
Yankees lose, it's a great day.
that's
I
right.
doesn't matter. I don't care who's playing them.
That's
When the
right.
Yankees lose, life is good.
It is good. It is good. That's you just it only won one of four, but hey, they won the one. That's the critical thing. So yeah,
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 good deal.
it's
All
fun.
right.
Yeah.
Well, let's get to the subject at hand. Today, we're going to talk about the decline of the church in the West.
Hmm.
A lot of conversation over this of late, Michael. A lot of uh, ink's been spilled in talking about it. And one of the reasons, well, being a pastor for 38 years, this was constantly before me.
Right.
And, now I'm retired, and I've got younger colleagues that I have the very great privilege of meeting with regularly and mentoring them. But they're really, it's a real struggle
Sure.
because of just things aren't what they were. But one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation is, and it's part and parcel of something that we've talked a lot about in various issues when we've talked, and that is the human tendency, almost default, to want to explain every problem with a simple solution.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
The
Right.
reason, the reason, here's what we need to do with immigration,
Right.
and depending on which side of the fence you're on, you've got a simple solution.
Right.
Um, and people do this all the time with this issue. That I have theologically conservative friends who say that the decline of the mainline church is because of their squishiness of doctrine
Yeah.
and their giving into culture when it comes to human sexuality. I've
Right.
got my liberal friends who say the conservative church is in decline because they're not welcoming. to everybody, and they're pushing people away. I got
Right.
Catholic friends who seem to think only the Protestant church is in decline.
Right.
I
Yeah.
can tell
Right. Yeah.
that
Right.
no, you Catholics may not be going down as fast as we are, but you're going down.
You're going down. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so um, I I want to say that there's just large stuff going on here. By the way, those causes in certain specific contexts might be true,
Right.
right?
Right.
But to say, it's just one thing, and I just think there's a larger thing going on here. So the purpose of our just conversation is to say, folks, this is complicated. This is complex.
Right.
Let's at least understand the complexities of the problem,
Right.
even though we may not have any deeply profound solutions.
Right. Yeah. I agree. Yeah. I think it's always. I think a key piece of this too is when we say there's a lot of loaded language here. When we say the church is in decline, well, what do you mean by decline? And the sociologist in me wants to know. So how do you operationalize decline? What does
Yeah,
that mean? And when you say church, what does church mean? I think that's
yeah,
that's also part of the challenge. Um, I think certainly the traditional institutions of what we have thought of as the church in the United States, that certainly is in decline. I don't think there's any
yeah.
question about that. But in terms of measuring, in terms of influence, in terms of numbers, and that type of thing, I think that's clear. Um, but I think there's also the question of, so we, at least on the surface, had the church with influence in culture before, but was all the influence that the church had in culture truly what the church should have been promoting in the culture in the first place? So I
Well,
think,
exactly right. So, I
yeah.
mean, I
So
think your
it's
point about decline is good. I mean, I'm of the opinion that, well, and it's just not me. I mean, I think the studies
right,
they did that, for example, when COVID hit and a whole bunch of us started doing stuff online, worship services,
right,
and after we started coming out of that, we still did the online, and there were certain people who were fairly regular in church who just haven't come back, and
right,
they watch online. And a lot of the
right,
studies that have been done say that a lot of these people never really were actively involved in the first place.
right.
They,
Yeah,
they, they weren't really connected to the church community. So the fact that now they find a way to sit at home on a Sunday morning in their pajamas, drinking coffee, watching service, this really shouldn't be a surprise to us
correct.
that
Yeah,
they were sort of on for their own reasons, for their own
right,
decisions. They were sort of on the boundary, on the fringe of active involvement,
right.
and so, for me, the question always is that, um, does the decline of the church mean that we end up with ultimately with people who hopefully are more faithful to the gospel?
Exactly.
Uh,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So there's just a whole bunch of things to do. By the way, just Michael, just so you know, when you were talking there a minute ago, your
Uh-huh.
picture froze,
Oh, it
but we
did.
could still
Okay.
hear your voice. So, folks, we're working with a new podcast platform,
Okay.
so we may have to iron out a few bugs here and there. So be patient with us, okay? So, but yeah, you went a little stiff there, Michael, but we could hear your voice, so we were
Okay.
good.
Good.
So, uh, anyway, so let's talk a big picture. I'm going to refer to. I don't know if I should have asked you this before we went on, but I don't know if you've read the book The Great Dechurching
I've not read it,
by
but I've
Jim.
heard reviews of it. Yeah.
Yeah, Jim Davis and Michael Graham. I'm going to riff off
Right.
of them a little bit. But the first thing to
Okay.
say before we get into that is post industrial societies are less religious.
Right.
It's just true.
Right.
We've seen this happen in Europe. Europe's ahead of us. Canada and Australia are maybe a decade ahead of us. Post industrial societies. And by the way, I would argue one of the reasons we're kind of behind uh, these other countries is the Sunday school movement in America.
Okay.
That's a I don't want to. That's another issue for another time. I think that's one major reason why we are behind, but we're headed
Right.
that way. And so post-industrial societies are just less religious,
Right. Yeah.
and and that's where we are.
Right. Well, and I would piggyback on that with a related observation. Um, Going really big picture, if we go back 500 years ago to the Reformation, that preceding the Reformation was the invention of the printing press. And the printing press began to make the Bible accessible to common people. It also made all sorts of other knowledge widely available to other people, where people were able to ask questions, to think in ways that they hadn't thought of before, because they were exposed to new ideas and new ways of seeing things that they had never seen. And that was, as much as anything else happening at the time, contributed to all of the turmoil and the upheaval of the institutions and the systems that existed at that time, both in government and religion and everything. And I think we still, because we're in the middle of it, we find it hard to see the revolution that has happened with the internet in the past
I am
generation or
losing you,
two.
Mike.
Uh, uh,
Mike, Michael, you're
okay,
fading in and out. Just so you know.
okay. Can you hear? Am I back now? I saw it was reconnecting there. You have me?
Now I do.
Okay, good. Now you got me. Okay. Well, we'll see if
Yeah.
this works or not. But the the fact that the internet and the fact that that makes so much information available at people's fingertips, and then people see the world through other people's eyes that they would never been able to see them for with great ease, has just as revolutionary impact in terms of how we think about our own cultures and our own religions. And it's a challenge. And for those that are deeply embedded in those cultural traditions and find great value in them, that's a threat. It's
Yeah.
it's a very serious threat. And so I think that that's part of what spawns, and not just in the United States, but in other places around the world as well too, some of these reactionary movements where we have to stop the change. We have to go back to what was before, whatever that idealized version of before was,
Yeah.
and preserve that. Otherwise, it's all going to fall apart. That's part of a natural, I think, response of some minority of humanity in every big change that happens in the world. And so some of this, I think, is to be expected. I'm not saying that explains everything that we're talking about in the American context, but I just think we should not disconnect ourselves from the larger global phenomena of what's happening
Yeah.
with globalization and spread of information and how that's changing the world. Yeah.
Yeah. And the world's a smaller place.
Yes. Keep
In many
shrinking.
ways for us. It keeps shrinking, and we get and it's one thing to be able to, for example, caricature atheists or caricature a Muslim. But when you live next door to one and they're just really nice people, right?
Right.
It's sort of less of an us versus them kind of a thing. And for some people, not for everybody to be sure, but for some people, there's that creates an identity crisis.
Right.
When older people say to me, I guess we're in that camp, Michael.
Yeah. That's a,
When older people say to me, I miss the America I grew up in.
yeah.
What I hear and what I think they're saying, and I'm not saying this is what they're directly saying. I don't think they really know it, but I
Yeah.
think what they're saying is that, and this is people who are white
Right.
that they don't know how to articulate it, and they certainly would deny it. But I think what they're saying is that they miss a society where the white folks are kind of in charge, and
Yeah.
the minorities are free,
Right.
but we get to run the show.
Right.
And I think when you see just the reaction to, for example, we just celebrated Juneteenth. When you see it's the reaction of some whites at Juneteenth, why do we need Juneteenth? We got Independence Day, right?
Yeah. Right.
Or the reaction to the Super Bowl playing the Black National Anthem, "Lift Every
Right.
Voice and Sing," which I think is a wonderful hymn.
Right. When we
um,
when we
I
say
think,
Black
I
Lives
think,
Matters, you
or
say
Black
Black
Lives
Lives
Matter,
Matters, and people have to
and
say all lives matter.
yeah, and I think it's a way.
Yeah.
I think what's being pressed there is that discomfort
Right.
that culturally we are changing. Our demographics is changing. We know this.
Right.
I don't know what year you may know, Michael. I don't know what year uh, there is a year coming up when there's going to be no discernible ethnic majority in the United States. I
Yeah.
think years ago I read 2050. I don't know if it'll be sooner or not.
Yeah. Well,
And
already for
so anyway,
people that
I
are,
think, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I think mine says reconnecting here. I hope we're still working. So I think for
I hear
people
you.
under 40 or 45, I think the majority of people already are not white in
Yeah.
America. So
Yeah.
in terms of what we call our racial categories, I think that's already true for the younger half of the population.
Yeah.
And so it's coming very soon. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I think creates discomfort in the church because the church, by the way, as we know in America, is very segregated,
Right.
um, and uh, and I think for all kinds of reasons. I don't think
Right.
there's just one reason why that's the case. I don't
Right.
think there's anything nefarious about that necessarily. I just think
Right.
there's a lot of differences in cultural worship and different things that we create that, but we are divided that way.
Right.
And we all here's the other thing: um, immigrants from the global.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Right. 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 And I think it's been a tendency, I think, all throughout the church's history. There's a tendency to confuse maintaining a faithfulness to the gospel. Well, how should I say this? Let me back up. So, if we are Christians, we should be seeking the well-being of our communities and our societies, which means we should be people who are trying to keep the institutions and the practices that are good, to keep those in flourishing, to keep those moving ahead and supporting those. But the problem is that we're embedded in those, and we don't see the evils sometimes that are involved in the ways that we've organized things. And so, as we become aware that there are problems with the way we've organized things and we need to change, many of us have developed this view that we have to preserve what was because that's part of what God ordained. Um, and we begin to fuse cultural standards with our particular understanding of God, and the two become one, rather than holding one in one hand, one in the other, and realizing that there's a tension here that has to be lived in. You think about Israel with the idea that there was a king who was responsible for instituting and running government. That you also had prophets who stepped in and said, "This has to change, or else, there are going to be problems here." And that dynamic tension uh, seems to need to exist, and the church often seems to me to get sidelined into one extreme or the other of that, of trying to be king, trying to control everything and mandate the way that the world has to be, versus being a prophet, which is standing outside and being critical and calling to a newer vision. And there are excesses with either of those types of roles that the church plays, and I think that that's where we often find the struggles finding out how to meld that together. Yeah.
Let me. I'm getting a message on this.
Okay.
Folks, you're seeing this in real time. Okay, we're recording. I guess it says browser preventing recording. We recommend refreshing this page.
Okay.
Um, okay, that is not helpful for me. So I guess I have to refresh the page.
Okay.
And will we come back? Wait, this is just really crazy.
See if it stays there or not. See if it works. Go ahead and
Uh,
refresh.
yeah, it's uploading. Okay, so
Okay. Good.
let's continue. We'll
Okay. Yeah.
continue. Hopefully, we won't have to do this again. But let's
We'll
try
figure
it.
it
See
out.
what's going.
Yeah.
This is such a top efficiently run thing.
Yeah.
Man, we know what we're doing. All right.
That's right.
So let's talk. So let's drill down to some others
Right.
because there are some other things going on too with this. So And I'm going to go with the book, The Great Dechurching. So one of the things in The Great Dechurching is that, and disillusionment with church leadership.
Right.
We scandals, moral failures. We've seen this in the mega churches. We've seen this in the Catholic Church, and it's not just mega churches as far as Protestants. It's other places as well. Although what I would say, and I'm a Methodist, you're a Presbyterian, so you know more about the
Right.
Presbyterians. But in the United Methodist Church, we have some real good policies in place to where when there's a problem, we take care of it really quickly.
Right.
So you don't have anything happening like in some of these mega churches where a pastor is involved in a sexual liaison or whatever, and then the church leadership covers it up and they make people sign non-disclosure agreements when they hire them and all of that kind of what I think sounds real seedy,
Right.
to be honest.
Right.
We do have that, but that doesn't mean we don't. I mean, it doesn't mean it's foolproof.
Right.
Because I know of several examples within the last decade in my conference. But the point is we dealt with it really quickly. But
yeah, correct.
Just disillusionment with church leaders not practicing what they preach egregiously.
Yes. Right.
And I mean, why, I don't think people expect pastors to be morally perfect, but boy, we need to not get the big things wrong. And then to continue to deny it or to blame the victim just makes things worse for the church.
Right. Well, and we're in a culture that has increasingly become about celebrities. I think I'm trying to remember, was it Leonard Sweet or something that talked about the 20th century that the authority was the scientist, and in the 21st century the authority would be the shaman or the guru, so to speak, the one that could tell a story and get people involved in it. And you really see some of that it's not so much the most knowledgeable person or the person who is has the most credentials or most qualified. It's often the most charismatic is who people are following in a lot of these situations. And that tendency to follow charisma apart from accountability structures being in place, that's where you see a lot of this going. And I think the church has drifted more and more. They say the church, by that I mean across many denominations, the American Christianity has drifted more and more that direction, that there seems to be less accountability. Yeah. And that creates suspicion and disillusionment with the idea that there's why is this institution any different than any other cultural institution? They're just as bad, if not worse, than the others. I mean, that's where it ends up.
Well, we don't show ourselves to be a light, to use the Jewish phrase,
right,
in the Old Testament, to be a light to the nations. We just aren't.
Right.
And that gets in the way. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So another one is perceived irrelevance. I mean, this is a big one, and I think it's big with the younger generations that our teachings and practices are just not relevant to the lives of people, and the church is sort of out of touch with contemporary issues and concerns, people, just particularly younger people, aren't into it.
Yeah, right. I think I mentioned this before in another podcast that we did or somewhere recently, but it's one of my favorite bumper stickers going back years ago. Had this big thing on it that says, "Jesus is the answer." And underneath in parentheses, it says, "What was the question?"
Yeah,
right. Jesus is the answer to what? And I think that the answer that we put forward as the church frequently is an answer to a question that's not being asked by the rest of the culture. I think when we were growing up, when we were kids, there was still very much this sense that the church was about right and wrong and being a morally good person and wanting to get to heaven and not go to hell and that kind of thing. There was this sense of it was all about right and wrong and being a good person. Whereas I don't sense that a lot of people that's the central question, at least certainly with younger generations, that's a question that they're really asking. They want to know meaning. They want to know purpose. They want to know, you know, what is my place in life? And if our whole orientation is about right and wrong and being a good person so you can go to heaven, that's not the question that's being asked. And
Yeah.
so we can criticize whether we think that they're asking the right question or not, but we can criticize that all we want. But that's the reality. And the church always has to be speaking to the culture that it's in and the questions that they're
Yeah.
asking. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it should be a classic missions 101 is
Yeah.
that you deal with people where they are, not where you think they should be.
Right.
And, and so, a classic example was I was involved, and this has been several years now because I ended up having to block the person on social media.
Yeah.
But I have a Facebook friend. She's an atheist. I have more than one Facebook friend, and I don't remember exactly what I posted, but she responded, and so she and I were having a really good conversation. Um, and then all of a sudden, some guy pipes in and tells her, "Oh, you need to start reading Genesis this or that or the other." And
Yeah.
I'm like, she doesn't believe it,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
What?
Yes.
Tell her to read Genesis. Oh, she'll be all straightened out now. She
I'll
doesn't
fix it.
believe. She doesn't believe these texts are
Yeah.
are what we believe they are as Christians. So that's not where you start,
Right.
right?
Right.
So sometimes we want to start where we're or where we're comfortable,
Right.
or trying to work with things. So yeah, it's so there's just a lot of people who just think what we do doesn't matter.
Right. Exactly. It's not that we're some because of the scandals and stuff that they see, they think the church is evil and terrible. I think there's a larger community that just thinks it's irrelevant.
Oh
It's
yeah,
it's
yeah,
uninteresting, and why would I waste my time with that? I've got other
yeah,
things that are more meaningful to invest
yeah.
my time
I
in.
can
Yeah.
I can spend Sunday morning at the beach,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Right.
yeah. Another one. Let's talk about this is negative church experiences.
Hmm.
Certainly, we know that there are people. My experience of the church overall, Michael, has been positive.
Yeah.
I grew up with a positive church experience with my parents, and I think it was my parents that sort of set that framework.
Right.
I grew up in what I would call a fundamentalist context, but I didn't have the negative experience that some people report. And I just think it's my parents, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
kind of filtered some of that stuff. So I could never go back to that.
Right.
But I've always had this positive experience. But I do know there are people who have had very negative experiences that they've experienced being judged or excluded. There's conflict within a church, and there are some people that if it lasts long enough, they ain't hanging around for that,
Right.
because who wants to go to church on Sunday morning for conflict? That's what I want to do with my mornings each week. And then of course, hypocrisy,
Right.
just outright hypocrisy, and I mean, I think we're experiencing some of that, in a stark way in our politics, the
Sure.
hypocrisy of Christians.
Yeah.
And again, this is not to say, I always like when someone says, when I'm talking like this, they say, well, no one's perfect. I'm like, who's saying that? You know,
Exactly. It says you have to be.
nobody
Yeah.
is saying no one's perfect. This is not of course, no one's perfect. That
Right.
isn't the point. But there
Right.
are some blatant kinds of ways of behaving that's very different from what you say you believe, right?
Right. Right.
And it's and it's just so that kind of negative church experience. And by the way, because of social media, those kinds of stories get legs because somebody shares it, and
Yeah.
then someone else. I mean, I've been on threads where somebody has had a bad experience, is no longer in church, will share something, and then you just look at the comment threads, and boy, people are saying, I had this bad experience, that bad experience. So,
Right.
let's be honest that sometimes there are times when the church has done a lot of damage. We've done damage,
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
and it's public.
Yeah. It's a very real part of many people's lives. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, another one, I hate going down the laundry list here, but another one is doctrinal disagreements. Now, there are some, my conservative friends are right that sometimes there are doctrinal disagreements that lead to people leaving the church, or, differences over social issues, moral teaching. My United Methodist Church, we just experienced that big time.
Right.
Um, and so that is true,
Right.
that does happen. Different understandings of the way to read Scripture, um, and uh, it does figure in. It isn't the overarching thing, but it does figure in.
Right.
That sometimes people, because of their views that they have, that they say, I've got to. They either find a church that's more congenial, or sometimes they just leave. Period. They get fed up, and
Right.
so
Yeah. I mean, there's some topics I think maybe this is a slightly different one, but there are. Uh, I mean, this is a horse that's been beaten many times, but the whole thing, like around evolution, for instance,
yeah,
is evolution true or not? And churches that are insisting that you believe, in a 6-day creation. Well, if you have knowledge about something, you particularly a biologist, but you don't have to be that thoroughly embedded in science to have an appreciation for what evolution is and how it works. Um, you have knowledge of that, something that you have a deep knowledge of, that the church is not necessarily the best source for that particular topic, and yet they are proclaiming that you have to believe this way versus that, when you know what the truth is about a particular topic. Well, if they're being that way about that topic, what else are they being that way
exactly.
about with other things? And so therefore you operate from what you know. And so you judge based from what you know about things, and extrapolate that to make assumptions about other institutions and other people that you confront, how they relate to the topics that you know about. And so I think that the church's continual sort of head in the sand approach to many, not just evolution, but I'm just using that as an example, as a topic where they have this pronouncement that just oversimplifies or completely misses the truth that other people already know. I guess, is that a doctrinal issue? Possibly. I think that for some people want to retain their faith, but they can't hang on to the prescriptions that the church has laid around topics they already know about. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's and that brings back that you brought up the issue of evolution. The other thing that
Yeah.
Davis and Graham talk about in their book is intellectual skepticism. That there are
There you go.
people
Yeah.
who have left the church um, because they've been in a context where they're told there are certain things they simply can't believe, that, and they go to college. And by the way, I dealt with this when I was in a church, another church years ago before I retired. We were near a
Right.
university, and so we had a college ministry, and I would go to the college, and I worked with University Christian Fellowship. And there were college students who were just really struggling because their church was telling them, they couldn't believe what they were learning in biology class,
Right.
and
Right.
and the, and biology class was making a lot more sense to them, and
Right.
and so I would give them permission to believe that. I said, I'm not going to tell you what church you should or shouldn't go to, but I'm one pastor who believes in this stuff, believes in evolution, and in fact, if God is Trinity as we believe, then actually evolutionary creation makes sense,
Right.
which is another topic. But um, it's in a way to interpret the Bible that's the problem. And what
Right.
happens is these folks confuse interpretation of Scripture with the authority of Scripture. So Ken Ham, Creation Museum guide there in Kentucky, says that if you don't believe in a literal 6-day creation, you are denying the authority of Scripture. The answer to
Right.
that is no, I'm not denying the authority of Scripture. I'm denying your interpretation. You're
Right.
reading it
Right.
wrong.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Right.
So it isn't a denial of the authority of Scripture. And so we continue to pro, well, some churches continue to promote this. And by the way, it's not just biology. I mean, just the fight we had during COVID over vaccines was just incredible to me,
Yeah,
Michael.
just crazy. Yeah,
200
yeah,
plus years of vaccine science, 200 plus
yeah.
years, and
Yes.
and what we have eradicated, right, because of
Yeah,
vaccines.
exactly.
And just amazing to me, just absolutely amazing to me.
Right.
um, the human capacity to be irrational in a rational way is, or to try to be rational
Yeah,
in an irrational way, is just amazing. But anyway,
yeah,
so there is the skepticism then people have, because they're thinking we're still we've got views from the Dark Ages. Although I would say the church in the 16th century actually, in some ways, believed things that weren't nearly as uh, destructive as they are today.
right.
So you got a lot of young people leaving the church because, you know, I want to become a biologist, I want to become an astronomer, but the church I attend says I've got to have a whole different perspective on how all this works, when
Right.
I know the science tells us otherwise.
Right. And I think the church has um, largely seen itself as having a gatekeeper role in society, of trying
Yeah.
to say what the truth is, and they were able to keep, if not silenced, keep at a distance those things that
Yeah.
might challenge the church's understanding of the world and how that gets viewed. Well, guess what? Past generation or two, I mean, it was developing before then, but it has really exploded with the existence of the internet in the past generation or so. The availability to information, that the church can no longer be the gatekeeper. It can no longer maintain a sense of coherence by things by just keeping stuff out and having everybody believe what the church believes. You can't do that, and that's the sense of what I feel some of the conservative reactionary elements are, is that they want to get back to where the church is the gatekeeper again. We can keep all this other. Well, you're never going to keep all that out. That's never going to happen again. But that's the world they knew, and that's the world that they would like to go back to. And I think there's also um, the issue, and we've talked about this in other episodes before, that throughout so much of human history, the church has been the leader in terms of things like taking care of the poor, taking care of the sick, of giving examples for how to do that, developing the institutions that help promote that. Well, particularly in the past few decades, past 100 years, a couple 100 years, going back even that far, the societies, the cultures of and our governments have taken on more and more of those roles. The church made it so prolific that this is what's supposed to be done, that it simply became part of our culture. That this is the culture supposed to do this, and so the government does it. So now you've got two things happening for the church. One hand, you've lost the ability to gatekeep what's truth, and the second thing is you've lost the ability, not entirely but largely, to be the sort of the foremost among providing care for people, for the sick and the suffering and that type of thing. Um, and so then that leaves an interesting question. Well, what is the role of the church, and what does it mean to be a Christian in this time? I'm trying to remember I can't remember the name of the author, but talked about that what it was a missiologist of some type, and they were talking about, I think it was in Africa, in a nation in Africa, and I forget which nation it was. But anyway, he was talking about working as a missionary there, and they would believe sort of the big picture stuff about God, that made sense. They would believe about the personal relationship with God, that made sense to them. But what about the stuff in the middle way, in between sort of the big ethereal picture and the personal picture, about how do I negotiate the things of daily life? with relationships with people, how are we supposed to organize our community, all those kind of things. The church often didn't have an answer for that. And I think that's, to me, feels like the big question that a lot of people are asking today is, what is the meaning of all this stuff that's in our life? Not that I'm starving to death, not that I'm needing care in our more developed societies. I don't think that's the case. And so they're asking a different question than what was needed in the past. And the church, to me, doesn't feel like it has the answers or the structural institutions to be able to nurture and present an answer to those questions, if that makes sense. And our
No, that
traditional
makes
structures aren't getting it done.
yeah.
And I don't know what the answer is. I'm just saying I think that's what's creating the crisis
Yeah.
for much of the church. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
No, I
these
agree
other
with that.
things that we've been talking about feel to me that they feed around the edges of all of this. That
Right.
those are, yeah.
Right. Right. What I'm attempting to do in our conversation with these things is to say this is all part and parcel of something much larger.
Yeah.
And these are not, so you can't pick one of these and say this is the answer. All we've got to do is change this,
Right.
I think one of the things I
Right.
would say too, Michael, when you talk about the angst, is that, I'm just going to name what I think is partially what's going on here, is that white Protestantism
Yeah.
is what we see within the last 8-9 years with the
Yeah.
phenomenon of Donald Trump is white evangelicalism, one last desperate gasp to stay in
Yes.
control.
Yes.
Because they I just saw what did I say see that was it Ryan Burge, I think, just posted something in which there are less white nationalists now than there were
Yeah.
50 years ago. But the difference is that they're virulent, that
Yeah.
so they're trying to hang on to something, and
Yeah.
they're trying to do it now because if they don't do it soon, and I don't think it's going to work,
Yeah.
but it's an attempt to hang on
Yeah.
to white Protestantism kind of being in charge. I mean, we have to remember that America, as Stanley Hauerwas always liked to remind us in class years ago, is the great Protestant experiment. And in
Right.
fact, he would say it's the great white Protestant experiment.
Right.
And that now is, kind of creating an issue. We've got some time left. There's just two final ones I want to talk about. I'm going to put them together
Sure.
because I think they
Okay.
really matter. And I think often ignored. And that is that personal life changes and competing priorities. That
Okay.
life is just different in 2024
Yeah.
than it was
Right.
in 1994. Our
Mhm.
population is aging, and it's the older folks that have the most disposable income. And it's the older folks who are sitting in the pews. And
Right.
these older
Yep.
folks are attending twice a month because they're visiting grandchildren or they've decided to go on a weekend somewhere.
Right.
And so you have that. I think you just have, and then you've got younger families that there's just so much going on right now, right?
Right.
Years ago, I listened to somebody give a presentation and he talked about how, 100 years ago, the center of the community was the church, and everything kind of
Right.
fed into the church and back. He drew another diagram after drawing that one and said the center of the community is the local school, and the
Okay.
local school controls everything in a sense.
Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
the high school is putting on a production, if a play, the sports, and they require, if you're going to participate in this, they require you make a commitment and an effort. And
Right.
so before you knew it, communities Wednesday night was no longer on the board as far as leaving that for churches. And then they started
Right.
playing on Sundays. And so it's just different priorities. And we preachers, we could rail against that and tell our
Right.
parishioners that, they need to be committed and they need to have their kids committed to being in church on Sunday. But the reality is, if the kid wants to play baseball, he's going to play baseball. And if they do stuff on Sundays, they do stuff on Sundays. And so
Right.
you've got a shift even in the attendance patterns of what we're going to call the faithful, those who do go
Right.
to church,
Yeah.
right? And by the way,
Right.
as a
Sure.
pastor, I started noticing this about 25 years ago, definitely.
Oh
And I
yeah.
started
Yeah.
noticing it because average attendance or Sunday attendance was swinging wildly. I mean, it would be down
Right.
30 one Sunday and up 25. I mean, it was not like 10. It was like wild, and it was just the faithful were living life, and I mean, I don't know what you do about that. That is something that is
Yeah.
just people have made decisions. They've made decisions of how they're going to prioritize things, and the church just doesn't figure in. The church
Right.
gets.
Yeah.
Uh, I always used to say that if I required for confirmation what coaches require for high school sports, or the drama uh, teacher requires to be in a play. If I required
Right.
that kind of time for confirmation, I'd have a line of parents outside my door of the church
Yeah.
office,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But they'll do
Yeah.
it for the school. So it just kind of gives you a picture of where things are. I don't know what we're going to do about that, but it's there.
Right. Right. I agree. And was it Phyllis Tickle who talked about every 500 years the church does a wholesale cleaning out of stuff and get rid of the stuff that doesn't work, and finds new ways to do things. And
Yeah.
Reformation was 500 years ago. It's time for the house cleaning, and I think it's already underway. I think it has been underway for a while, and I think we're probably living through times that are as disruptive and disconcerting as the time of the Reformation. Um,
Yeah.
I think we're in that, and it's hard to recognize how significant that is when you're in the middle of it. But I think that's where we're at in the early 21st century. Yeah,
I
and
agree with that. And I tell a lot of my young colleagues in ministry that I say you are courageous for what you're doing. You're pastoring in a very difficult time. Ministry has always been difficult, but
yeah,
but this is exceptionally difficult, and uh, but you're being courageous for doing your best to shepherd the people of God in the midst of this time. One of the things I would
right.
say, Michael, is that one of the I don't think there's any solution for this. But I would say this, that one of the things I think the church really needs to focus more on that it has not is that we've just not been good at making disciples. Um,
Yes,
we've
yes,
been good at winning
preach.
converts. We used to be good at winning converts, but that
Right,
didn't, just because you're a convert doesn't mean you're a disciple. And
right.
I just don't think the church, we did a good job, and I put that at the feet of the leadership. Um,
Yeah,
I don't think we've done a good job of that. I think there are some churches that are doing a good job of it, and they're seeing they're seeing maybe some growth. But more importantly, they're reaching out. David Fitch, I don't know if you know David. David Fitch teaches at Northern
uh-huh.
Seminary, and one of his things, he's written a lot of good stuff. But one of his things about the local churches, he says local churches just lost touch with their communities. How
Yes,
many
right,
when you look at your church, how many people from your neighborhood, right, who don't
right,
drive in from 6 miles out? I mean, people, if you
right,
walk the neighborhood, how many people attend that church? And that he
right,
says basically we just lost touch, and
right,
which is kind of strange when you think about it, because the mission of the church is to be in touch, but we were doing our
right.
own thing, just lost touch with the community, the neighborhood, and that also is a recipe for decline.
Yeah, and I think
Plus,
we've
if
lost
I'm
touch with. Yeah,
no, I was just going to say, plus if I live 6 miles away from my church, there might be three other churches that I drive by. It becomes
yeah,
very
right,
easy
yeah,
to
yeah,
change something if I want, right?
right, yeah, right, yeah, and I think that so geographically, in the sense of having those communities, we've lost touch with that. I think that that's one key element of it. I think another key element goes back to a conversation we had months ago. It touches on one aspect of it when we talked about how the church fails business people. The
Mm-hmm.
church is not in touch with the questions and the struggles that affect people's daily lives as they go through them. And if just to for those that were part of that discussion, we're talking about how the church fails business people. It's not the idea that the church is supposed to just somehow become cheerleaders and rah rah rah, people that are in business unthinkingly. The issue is to create courageous spaces for people that are Christians who are struggling to live their life in a Christian in a context that's hostile to Christianity and the values that Christianity expresses, to give them a courageous space to have those conversations for how to do that. And that is not the experience of the vast number of church people. But I'll also emphasize, and this is part of the problem, it's not a space that people in the pews, many of them, want either, because they don't want
Right.
to confront the difficult things. They prefer to
Well,
keep
that's
it
the other issue is
compartmentalized.
that, you have a
Yeah,
lot of young people who think issues of immigration matter. They think justice matters. They think this matters. And then they see churches just not wanting to talk about it because they don't want the
right,
controversy or they don't want to upset anybody.
right,
But they
yeah,
think that should be part and parcel of what it means to follow Jesus is about. So,
right. That should be part of the
yeah,
conversation. Yeah, right. Yeah. So that's the other challenge. Yeah.
yeah. All right. Well, I think we have done this one, and long on the problem, short on solutions, but it's where we are, and
Right.
so all
And
right.
I think what that should part of what we should take from this is to also to be patient with ourselves. Um, we need the challenge to be spurred to action, to recognize that we can't just keep doing what we've always done, but to recognize this the complexity that our sense of lostness in terms of how to respond is just part of being in this dynamic situation. And that's where it requires more reliance on God and more seeking God, because it is such a disconcerting and unsettling time to live
Yeah,
in. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I've compared this situation to exile. The church is in exile, and at some point a remnant will return. And I don't know. I mean, it's what it is. Again, I think that maybe there is some winnowing going on, and
Right.
so we'll see. We'll do
A
our
time
thing.
to build up and a time to tear down.
Time to build up, time to tear down. So, and a time to
Yeah.
sign off. So we need to end this out. And so, great to be in conversation with you again, Michael. And we'll try next month. We'll
Yes.
have
Good to
some.
see you.
Well, you too. We'll have some interesting subject to ponder. Friends, thank you for joining us. This is Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Alan Bavera. A reminder that the patron saint of faith seeking understanding is Anselm of Canterbury, who said, "I do not understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand." So, friends, keep seeking.
Bye.